Can you imagine a world where one bad summer meant death? Where people had to choose whether to plant their grain or cook it for their children's supper? What did a day look like when there was nothing on the table but bark soup? Where the last scraps of bran were hidden in cellars, and there was no more room in the graveyards? Step into a world where food was never guaranteed. We find ourselves in the midst of the medieval famine. Welcome to Horologium Historia. Let's dive in.
This morning we had nothing to give the children. With the last of the bran, my wife baked a thin flatbread, hard as a board, dark, almost bitter. Even the dog turned up his nose at it and slunk under the bench. The children were silent. Little Jakub held the piece in his hand, just turning it over and over, as if hoping to somehow conjure a scrap of meat from it. Ilishka cried quietly, not because someone had hurt her, just because she was hungry and didn't know what to do about it. My wife sat by the stove, her eyes as empty as the bowl on the table. She didn't say a word, not even a curse. And maybe that's the worst part. We went to the barn 3 times, hoping by some miracle to find a forgotten sack of barley. But there was nothing, only mouse droppings and cobwebs. Outside it's snowing. The path through the fields has disappeared beneath a white blanket. And just like that path, our strength is fading. Each day we rise, dress, fetch wood, and know there is no food left. That hurts more than hunger itself.
The daily struggle for food during times of famine was a struggle for survival. Everything edible disappeared: flour, legumes, dried fruit, lard, even grain. Once the supplies ran out, people began replacing food with whatever was usually meant for livestock: bran, straw, bark flour. Bran cakes became a common meal: coarse, dry, tasteless, and sometimes even harmful to health. People ground up dry pods, crushed weed seeds, or dried grass to make a kind of bread that only vaguely resembled real food. Roots, acorns, birch bark, anything that could be boiled went into the pot. And when even that ran out, more desperate measures followed: boiling leather, eating carrion, and in some places, even cannibalism. The most critical time of year was always winter and early spring. Whatever had been harvested in autumn was often long gone, and the fields offered nothing yet in return. The peasant faced a cruel choice: eat the last of the seed stock and risk having nothing to sow the following year, or endure the hunger and hope for spring. These were true tests, not just of the body, but of morality and humanity itself. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more like it, give us a like and don't forget to subscribe.
It's the second year in a row that nothing has grown. Last year, our fields were flooded. The water stood for so long that the ears of grain turned black before they had a chance to ripen. And this year came the hail. At the end of May, just when we had begun to hope for a good harvest, the young stalks were struck down like blades of grass, and nothing remained. My neighbor Jindra sold his last cow. He said he had nothing left to feed her. He got a handful of salt and a few dried fish in return. When I saw him breaking apart the manger and throwing the wooden boards into the fire, I knew he had given up even hope. Today I stood in the field, snow-covered, silent. The place where food should be now lies under a crust of ice. I wonder whether we should even bother planting when spring comes. My wife counted the seed bags. 3 small pouches, and that's all we have left. But even if we sow them, what if it all goes wrong again? What if drought comes, or strong winds, or the beetles devour our fields? When night falls and we sit in the dark, I speak to the children about food I remember from long ago: how freshly baked bread used to smell, how porridge tasted with butter. But I'm starting to realize that for them, these are nothing more than fairy tales. They've never tasted any of it.
Famines in the Middle Ages were often the result of repeated crop failures that could last for several consecutive years. Peasants farmed without any means of protecting their crops. They were entirely dependent on the weather and the natural cycles of the land. One bad year was enough to spark rationing. A second meant hunger. Fields could be destroyed by flash floods. Rivers overflowed their banks, drowned the crops, and left behind only mud and rot where grain once grew. Another year might bring devastating hail that wiped out entire fields in a matter of minutes. And then there were the years when spring frosts, summer droughts, and autumn molds followed one another. The grain never sprouted or didn't survive. Frozen seedlings, blighted ears, or seeds devoured by mice. These were common causes of ruin. There were no fertilizers or irrigation systems to support the harvest. Peasants plowed with shallow blades, practiced no crop rotation, and the soil was quickly exhausted. There was no centralized aid and no effective storage system. Reserves were limited and entirely dependent on the resources of each individual village. When one bad year came, people relied on the help of neighbors. When the second year arrived, there was no one left with anything to offer. A similar catastrophe struck much of Europe between 1315 and 1317 during the so-called Great Famine. After several rainy seasons in which the grain failed to ripen and supplies were rapidly depleted, collapse followed. Not only peasants, but also townspeople died. Some chronicles speak of people who ate bark, dead animals, and eventually, even one another.
This morning I found my wife picking through spruce twigs and dropping them into a pot of water. She said that if you boil them, they're good for the body. When I tasted it, my tongue stuck to the roof of my mouth. But the children drank it without a word. Yesterday, my father started eating mushrooms he had dried in the fall. He claimed he could tell which ones were edible. Now he's lying under a blanket, pale as a sheet, vomiting into a bucket. I'm afraid he won't make it through the night. I remembered how in the autumn the children gathered acorns in the forest, carrying them home in their aprons, their hands covered in dirt. We crushed them, soaked them, dried them by the stove. If you grind them just right, you can bake them into flatbread. But there are none left now. All of it has been eaten. We've taken everything the forest had to give, and I'm afraid that in a few days we'll be chewing hay.
When the supplies from the fields and cellars ran out, people turned to nature, to the forests, meadows, and thickets. They gathered anything that even vaguely resembled food. One of the most common emergency ingredients was birch bark, especially the inner, softer layer, which was dried, crushed, or boiled into soup. Tree buds, young twigs, moss, roots, and dried grass were also collected. In the autumn months, people often gathered acorns, which were soaked in water to remove their bitterness, then dried and ground into flour. Acorn flour was used to bake simple flatbreads or as an additive in bread substitutes. Mushrooms were another possibility, but also a dangerous one. Without proper knowledge, it was easy to poison oneself. Many people dried mushrooms for storage, but if they misjudged the type or preserved them poorly, it led to nausea, hallucinations, and sometimes death. The same was true for berries. Some, like rowan berries, were nutritious. Others were toxic. Children sent into the forest often returned with stomach pain, and some suffered lasting harm. Winter was the hardest time. There was nothing left to forage, and everything had to be carefully preserved in autumn. The most common methods of preservation were drying, fermenting cabbage or turnips, salting, and storing food in cellars, basements, or pits lined with straw. But even these stores rarely lasted until spring. At the turn of winter and spring, people waited anxiously for the first wild herbs: nettles, ground elder, sorrel. These were small salvations, full of vitamins, warding off scurvy and strengthening the body. Puchalka also appeared, sprouted peas roasted dry in a pan, or prajmo, grain toasted without water. These meals were far from tasty, but they meant the difference between life and death.
Yesterday, our neighbor John packed up his family, his wife, 2 boys, even the little one who can barely walk. He wrapped up a few clothes, a small bag of rye, and they set off south. To Austria, he said. Someone at the market told him they still have bread there. We stood behind the barn and waved as they left. Jan said he couldn't just wait for the children to die of cold and hunger. They left on foot. Everything stayed behind: the house, the tools, even the chicken coop. In our village, only the old and the sick remain, people who don't have the strength to leave or no place left to go. Sometimes I walk down the road and see open houses, no one inside, just cold and silence. At night, I'm afraid. Not for myself, but that someone might come. It's happened already. Someone kicked in the door and took whatever they found. The food was gone, even the cooking pot. During the day, people borrow shovels. At night, they carry knives.
In times of greatest hunger, people no longer tried to survive at home. They searched for salvation elsewhere. Many villagers abandoned their fields, their homes, and the traditions they had known for generations, setting out in search of food in cities, other regions, or even across borders. From famine-stricken areas, waves of desperate people set out, on foot, with carts, with children in their arms. From lands across Central Europe, they moved toward wealthier regions like Meissen, Saxony, or Lower Austria, where agriculture had fared better or where stronger administration provided some stability. Likewise, from parts of what is now Poland or Silesia, the hungry made their way westward, to the Rhineland or further south. But the cities were not prepared. The poor newcomers often ended up in shelters, monasteries, or on the streets. Many died before receiving any help, and the villages they left behind remained empty. Sometimes entire settlements vanished. Either their inhabitants had died, or they had left and never returned. This mass movement of people tore apart long-rooted social bonds. Communities where traditions and neighborly support had been passed down for generations collapsed. Famine plunged society into chaos. Trust faded, and violence grew. In a time when food was more valuable than gold, moral principles lost their power. Theft, robbery, and even murder for a loaf of bread were no longer unthinkable.
Today, our neighbor Anna died. She was still sitting by the stove in the morning, but she wasn't breathing anymore. She just stayed there, eyes closed. She was so light we carried her wrapped in a blanket. She had no strength left. We men buried her at night, outside the village. The cemetery is full, the ground is hard, and the priest says there's no room left to dig. People die every day. You wake up in the morning and someone is gone. And if no one dies, someone just lies there in silence, as if they're simply waiting. We don't bury the dead like we used to. There's no wood for coffins, no time, and no strength. The soil is frozen. The shovel won't go in. We dig only shallow graves and cover them quickly. We say the prayers silently in our heads.
During times of famine, people didn't die from hunger alone. Their bodies, weakened and exhausted, had no defenses, and so malnutrition was soon followed by disease. A frail organism could no longer fight off even the most common infections. Dysentery, typhus, pneumonia, chills, and fevers became widespread. Contaminated water and poor hygiene helped diseases spread quickly, especially in poor communities and overcrowded households. At the same time, traditional burial customs began to break down. Cemeteries were overflowing, graves were dug shallow or not at all. When multiple people died at once, mass graves were created, bodies laid to rest without coffins, often without any ceremony. Frozen ground made digging nearly impossible, and as a result, corpses sometimes remained unburied, accelerating the spread of epidemics. Ordinary people tried to maintain order. The village reeve organized grave digging, the church sent priests to the dying, and city councils issued burial regulations. But in times of mass death, even these institutions failed. Priests died just like the peasants. Reeves fled the villages, and towns closed their gates to the flood of sick and starving. The fabric of community began to unravel. Those who once helped their neighbors now locked their doors.
We have a few grains of barley left, in a small pouch on the shelf, tied with string, hidden from hunger, and from temptation. We look at them every day. Should we sow them or cook them into porridge? The children are hungry. My wife grows thinner with each passing week. I know I should help them, that I should take those grains and throw them into the pot. But then I ask myself, what will we eat next autumn? If we plant them and they grow, maybe we'll survive another winter. But what if they don't? What if rain washes them away, or mice eat them, or frost destroys them like last year? And if we eat them now, we're guaranteed one more day, maybe two. Every evening we look at that little pouch and decide. But every morning, we're one decision closer to the end.
One of the hardest decisions during a famine was what to do with the last remaining seed. Almost every peasant faced the same choice: to sow it and hope for a harvest, or to eat it and survive a few more days. Seed was the key to the future, but also a temptation when there was nothing else left to eat. Many hid it, guarded it, even buried it underground. Others sacrificed it and paid for it with hunger the following year. Even after the famine ended, normal agricultural life could not simply resume. The seeds were gone. The animals had died over the winter or been eaten. People were exhausted, often ill and weakened. Fields lay fallow. Tools were broken or stolen, and there was no workforce. Many men and women had not survived. Beyond the physical devastation, the social consequences lingered. Crime had become a part of daily life. People who once respected laws and customs now stole, lied, or took by force whatever they could. The weakened population was also more vulnerable to the next disaster, especially disease. Famine and malnutrition had already broken immune systems, paving the way for the great plagues that would sweep through Europe in the decades to come. A society that had already collapsed had little strength left to face a second wave of suffering. And yet, in those few grains of barley someone had hidden away until spring, there lay the seed of a new beginning. The only question was, who would live to see it?
When we were children, Grandma used to tell us stories about the hunger during the reign of King Psemmisl. She said people ate dogs back then, and anyone who had a bit of bacon was like a king. We laughed by the fire, our bellies full of porridge, and told ourselves that something like that could never happen again. Today I sit in the dark and hear my own children whisper, "Do we still have anything to eat?" And I don't know what to say. I no longer hear Grandma. I hear myself. I'm becoming the one who will tell the story of hunger. I just don't know if there will be anyone left to hear it.
Famines were a constant threat in medieval life. Across Europe, they returned in irregular but devastating waves. In Central Europe, chronicles record famine in the year 1043, when people ate horses and dogs, or in 1126, when parents abandoned their children because they could no longer feed them. The famine of 1282 was linked to political chaos following the death of King Przemysl Ottokar II. Food prices soared, markets collapsed, and people looted granaries. But the greatest turning point came with the catastrophe of 1315 to 1317, known as the Great Famine. Across Western and Central Europe, relentless rain and failed harvests led to the collapse of agriculture. Supplies ran out, grain rotted in the fields, and millions died. This famine marked a profound shift. For the first time, Europe fully realized its vulnerability to nature and climate. It was a warning sign, one that came just 2 decades before an even greater disaster: the Black Death. And with famine came humanity's darkest acts. Cannibalism, spoken of in whispers, entered both folklore and official chronicles. In some cases, it was exaggerated, a ghost story meant to warn future generations. But in others, it was real, described even by city councils that punished the eating of the dead or the abduction of children. The experience of famine left a deep mark on the medieval mind. It was an inherited fear, something passed on by firelight, in songs, and in dreams. Famine didn't just leave empty granaries. It left behind stories that still ache centuries later. In the Middle Ages, hunger was a frequent visitor. It didn't always arrive as the result of a great catastrophe. Often, just a few bad seasons, poor distribution of supplies, or the failure of local authorities were enough to leave thousands without food. Peasants lived year to year. Most people had no reserves. What wasn't harvested wasn't eaten. And what wasn't eaten was missing in winter. Hunger, however, wasn't just a matter of weather. It was the result of the entire structure of society: dependence on a single crop, inadequate storage, slow relief, and a lack of support from both the state and the church. Today we have different technologies, different tools, different networks, and yet hunger has not disappeared from the world. It has only changed. The question remains, in the modern world, is hunger still a consequence of nature? Or is it, more than ever, a result of how we have chosen to organize the world? Did this glimpse into the harsh realities of the medieval world captivate you? Support our channel with a like and subscribe so we can explore more gripping chapters of history together. For now, this is Horologium Historia signing off.